"Don't look at him." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. And for a split second, the entire room seemed to pause, as if something unseen had just shifted. The restaurant had been glowing just moments earlier, warm amber lights reflecting off polished marble floors, crystal glasses catching every flicker like tiny stars, the low hum of conversation blending with the quiet clink of silverware. The kind of place where deals worth millions were discussed over aged bourbon and perfectly seared steaks, where power wore tailored suits and confidence walked without question. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, a billionaire CEO who had built his empire on control, precision, and the unshakable belief that every room he entered belonged to him. His posture relaxed, his voice measured, his presence enough to command attention without ever asking for it. But control is a fragile illusion, and it shattered in an instant when the door swung open harder than it should have, when the air changed, when voices dropped and chairs scraped against the floor, when a single command rang out sharp enough to silence even the most confident man in the room. And suddenly the carefully curated world of wealth and certainty unraveled into something raw and uncertain. Guests froze mid-motion. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing louder than it should have. And Ethan felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Not fear exactly, but the absence of control, the realization that for the first time in a long time, he was not the one setting the rules, and around him, people reacted the way people do when the unexpected breaks through their carefully built lives. Some ducked instinctively, others whispered under their breath, a few simply stared, unable to process what was happening. But in the middle of it all, moving quietly between tables just as she had all night, was Naomi Brooks, a waitress no one had noticed before. Not really, not beyond the quick glance or the absent-minded request. The kind of presence that blended into the background by design, her uniform simple, her movements efficient, her voice rarely heard unless spoken to, invisible in a room full of people who only saw what they expected to see. And yet now, as tension tightened around every breath, she stood differently, not louder, not dramatic, just still, grounded in a way that didn't match the panic unfolding around her, her tray resting lightly in her hand as if nothing had changed, her shoulders steady, her breathing even, as though the noise, the urgency, the disruption hadn't reached her the same way it reached everyone else. And it was that stillness, more than anything else, that began to draw attention, subtle at first, a glance here, a pause there, because in a room where fear was beginning to ripple outward, calm becomes impossible to ignore. Ethan noticed it without meaning to, his eyes shifting not toward the source of the chaos, but toward her, trying to understand why she wasn't reacting the way everyone else was, why her hands didn't tremble, why her gaze remained level, why she seemed to be observing rather than absorbing the moment. And for a man who had spent his life reading people, predicting outcomes, controlling narratives, this didn't make sense, because calm like that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from somewhere deeper, somewhere earned. And Naomi didn't move like someone caught off guard. She moved like someone who had seen something like this before, or at least something close enough that her instincts didn't betray her. And when she spoke again, quieter this time, almost as if the words were meant for one person but somehow reached everyone, the room shifted again, not outwardly, not in a way you could point to, but in that subtle, almost invisible way where attention realigns, where people begin to listen without realizing it. And Ethan felt it, the strange pull of it, the way the center of the moment was no longer where it had been seconds ago, no longer defined by the disruption at the door, but by the quiet presence of someone who had never been considered important enough to matter. And yet now, in the space between fear and reaction, she was the only one who seemed to understand something the rest of them didn't. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell, the man who owned the room, found himself watching someone else take control without ever raising her voice. Naomi did not raise her voice again, and that was what made people listen, because in a room where panic was beginning to build like pressure behind glass, silence carried more weight than shouting, and she understood that instinctively, the way some people understand rhythm or timing without ever being taught. Her eyes steady, not locked in confrontation but not avoiding either, just present, aware. reading the space the way others read spreadsheets or contracts, and the man near the door shifted his stance slightly, not aggressive, not calm, something in between, uncertain in a way that most people in that room would have missed, but Naomi did not miss it because she was not looking at the situation as a threat alone. She was looking at it as a pattern, a series of signals, a language without words, and every movement mattered. Every pause said something. Every hesitation revealed more than noise ever could. And behind her stillness was not luck, it was memory, not a single moment, but years layered together. Growing up in a neighborhood where raised voices did not always mean danger, but sudden silence sometimes did, where learning when to speak and when to stay quiet was not just a skill but a kind of protection, where you watched first, understood second, and acted last, because acting too soon could cost more than waiting, and that understanding sat quietly in her posture now, invisible to everyone except the few who knew what to look for, and Ethan, despite himself, was beginning to see it, because control had always been his strength, but reading people had always been his advantage, and something about Naomi did not match the role she was supposed to play. She was not reacting, she was calculating, not in a cold or distant way, but in a grounded, human way, as if she believed that even in this moment, there was still something to understand before anything needed to be done. And that belief was what made her different, what made her dangerous in a way no one expected, not because she challenged the situation, but because she refused to let it define her behavior. And the room began to mirror that shift without realizing it. The whispers softened, the sudden movement slowed. People who had been frozen started to breathe again, not fully relaxed but less chaotic, as if her calm had created a small pocket of stability in the middle of uncertainty. And even the man at the center of the disruption seemed to notice it, his attention flickering toward her more than once, drawn not by defiance but by something quieter, something unfamiliar, respect without words. And Naomi did not rush that moment. She did not push it, she let it exist, because she knew that forcing control often broke it, but guiding it gently could change it. And so she adjusted one small thing, her stance shifting just enough to signal openness, her hands visible, her tone measured when she finally spoke again, not asking, not demanding, just acknowledging, as if she were speaking to a person rather than a problem. And that distinction, subtle as it was, carried more weight than anything else in the room, because it changed the dynamic from confrontation to recognition. And recognition has a way of disarming tension without anyone noticing how it happens, and Ethan felt that too. The strange realization that the situation was not escalating the way it should have, not spiraling the way every instinct had warned him it would, but bending, slowly, almost imperceptibly, in a different direction, guided not by force, not by authority, but by someone who had neither in the traditional sense, and yet held something far more powerful in that moment. Understanding, the kind that does not come from books or boardrooms, but from experience, from having lived through enough uncertainty to know that control is not always about taking charge. Sometimes it is about knowing exactly when not to. And as Naomi held that balance, steady and unshaken, Ethan realized something that unsettled him more than the disruption itself, the realization that everything he had built his identity on, power, influence, command, meant nothing in a moment like this, because the person shaping the outcome was not the one with the most money, but the one who understood people the best. The shift was almost invisible, but once it started, it could not be undone, because tension does not disappear all at once. It loosens, thread by thread, and Naomi held that unraveling carefully, like someone who understood that one wrong pull could tighten everything again, her voice steady but low, never rising above the weight of the moment, never challenging, never retreating, simply existing in that narrow space between fear and trust. And that was where real change happened, not in loud declarations, but in quiet decisions, the kind that reshape outcomes without announcing themselves. And the man near the door hesitated again, longer this time, his shoulders dropping just slightly, the rigid edge in his posture softening into something more uncertain, more human. And Naomi saw it immediately, because hesitation is a language, and she had spent years learning how to read it, how to respond to it without forcing it, how to let it breathe just long enough to become something else. And behind her calm was a memory that had never really left her, A night years ago when the world had felt just as tight, just as unpredictable, when she had learned that panic spreads faster than anything. But calm, real calm, the kind rooted in understanding, spreads deeper. And so she had practiced it, not as a performance, but as survival. And now that same instinct guided her every movement, every word, every pause. And Ethan could not look away, because what he was witnessing did not fit into any framework he had ever used to understand power. It was not dominance. It was not negotiation. It was not leverage. It was something else entirely, something quieter but far more precise. And for the first time in a long time, he found himself not analyzing the situation for advantage, but observing it for truth. And the truth was unsettling, because the person shaping the outcome was someone he would not have noticed an hour ago, someone he might not have remembered at all. And yet now, she was the center of gravity in a room full of influence and wealth, and no one questioned it, not consciously, but instinctively, because people respond to presence more than titles. And Naomi's presence was undeniable, not loud, not forceful, but anchored in something real, something earned. And as the seconds stretched, the room adjusted around her, breath slowing, eyes focusing, movements becoming more deliberate, as if everyone was unconsciously following her lead. And even the man who had brought the disruption into the room seemed to mirror that shift. His attention no longer scattered, no longer driven by urgency, but drawn into the rhythm she had set, a rhythm built on patience and clarity rather than reaction. And Naomi took one small step forward, not enough to threaten, just enough to close the distance slightly, her expression unchanged, her tone even when she spoke again, choosing her words carefully, not to control him, but to connect, because connection changes outcomes in ways force never can. And that choice, that single approach, carried more weight than anything else she could have done, because it acknowledged something deeper, that beneath the tension, beneath the uncertainty, there was still a person standing there, not just a problem to be solved. And that recognition landed, subtle but undeniable, visible in the way his stance shifted again, in the way the sharp edge of the moment dulled just enough to create space. And in that space, possibility appeared, fragile but real, and Ethan felt it. The shift from inevitability to choice, the realization that what happened next was no longer predetermined, that the outcome was being rewritten in real time by someone who understood something he had overlooked his entire life, that people are not controlled through pressure alone. They are understood through patience, and that understanding can change everything. And as Naomi held that fragile balance steady, neither pushing nor retreating, just guiding the moment with quiet precision, Ethan realized that the most powerful move in the room was not the one that demanded attention, but the one that earned it without ever asking. Naomi did not rush the moment because she understood something most people in that room did not. That time, when handled correctly, becomes a tool, not an enemy. And every second she allowed the tension to breathe was another second the situation moved further away from chaos and closer to control. Not the kind of control Ethan had built his empire on, not forced or imposed, but something quieter, something that grew from awareness. And she could feel it now, the subtle shift in the air, the way the sharp edges of fear were dulling, the way the room was no longer holding its breath all at once, but beginning to exhale in fragments, small and careful, like people testing whether it was safe to exist again. And in that fragile transition, Naomi made her next move, not dramatic, not commanding, just deliberate, her voice calm as she spoke again, acknowledging the moment without escalating it, her words simple, grounded, human, as if she were guiding someone back from the edge of something they did not fully understand themselves. And that was the difference. She was not reacting to what was happening. She was responding to who was in front of her. And that distinction changed everything, because people do not resist understanding the same way they resist pressure. And the man's posture shifted again, a fraction lower, a fraction less rigid, his focus narrowing, no longer scattered across the room but fixed on her. And in that focus was something new, something unexpected, a pause that did not come from fear alone but from recognition. The quiet realization that he was being seen, not judged, not challenged, just seen. And that realization has a way of slowing everything down, of interrupting patterns that might otherwise continue unchecked. And Naomi held that space carefully, never pushing too far, never retreating too quickly, just enough to keep the moment balanced. Because she knew balance was the only thing holding the room together now. And Ethan watched all of it unfold with a growing sense of disbelief. Because nothing about this matched the outcomes he had always predicted in situations like this. There was no escalation, no breaking point, no sudden shift into something irreversible. Instead, there was this slow, controlled redirection, guided by someone who had no authority on paper, no influence in the traditional sense, and yet held the most influence in the room simply because she understood what others did not. And that realization unsettled him more than anything else, because it forced him to confront a truth he had never needed to face. That control without understanding is fragile, and in moments like this, it disappears completely, leaving only those who know how to read what cannot be measured. And Naomi read it all. The tension, the hesitation, the quiet signals that most people overlook, and she adjusted with each one. Her tone steady, her presence unwavering, her movements small but intentional, creating a rhythm that the room could follow without thinking. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, that rhythm began to replace the chaos that had filled the space moments before. Guests who had been frozen now shifted slightly, their shoulders lowering, their breathing evening out, their attention no longer scattered but centered, drawn into the calm she had created. And even the man at the center of it all seemed to respond, his stance no longer sharp, no longer unpredictable, but grounded in a way that suggested the moment had changed for him too. Not resolved, not over, but different. And Naomi recognized that difference immediately, because it was the opening she had been waiting for, the narrow window where a situation can be guided rather than endured. And she stepped into it carefully, not with force, not with urgency, but with quiet confidence, the kind that does not demand attention but earns it. And in that moment, as every eye in the room remained fixed on her, Ethan Caldwell understood something he had never learned in any boardroom, something no amount of money or influence could have taught him. That true control does not come from being the loudest voice or the most powerful presence. It comes from knowing exactly what a moment needs and having the courage to give it without hesitation. The opening did not come with a loud shift or a dramatic signal. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, the kind of change that only reveals itself after it has already begun. And Naomi felt it before she saw it, the subtle release in the air, the way the tension that had been holding everything in place started to loosen just enough to create space. And space was all she needed, because space allows choice, and choice changes outcomes. And so she did not rush forward or step back. She stayed exactly where she was, grounded, steady, letting the moment expand around her instead of forcing it into something it was not ready to become. And the man in front of her mirrored that shift in ways he did not fully understand himself, his stance no longer fixed, his attention no longer scattered, his breathing slower now, more controlled, as if the urgency that had driven him into the room was beginning to fade under the weight of something unfamiliar, something he had not expected to encounter. Not resistance, not fear, but calm, real calm, the kind that does not challenge but does not submit either. And that kind of calm has a way of making people reconsider their next move, because it removes the reactions they are prepared for, and without those reactions, the script they expected to follow no longer works. And Naomi knew that. She had seen it before in smaller moments, in quieter situations, when people came in carrying something heavy and expected the world to push back, only to find it did not. And in that absence of resistance, something inside them shifted, not all at once, but enough to change direction. And that was what she was guiding now. Not the situation itself, but the direction it was taking, one small adjustment at a time. Her voice soft when she spoke again, not instructing, not correcting, just offering something simple, something human, something that acknowledged the reality of the moment without feeding into its intensity. And that offering landed, visible in the way his shoulders lowered another fraction, in the way his focus stayed with her instead of scanning the room. And for the first time since everything had changed, the space felt less like a standoff and more like a conversation, fragile and unspoken, but real. And around them, the room followed that shift instinctively. People who had been frozen now adjusted their posture, their eyes no longer wide with uncertainty but searching, trying to understand what was happening, trying to follow the quiet lead being set in front of them. and Ethan remained where he was, watching, not as a man calculating risk or advantage, but as someone witnessing something he could not immediately explain, because everything about this moment defied the rules he had built his world on. There was no negotiation, no leverage, no display of power, and yet the outcome was changing, shaped not by force but by presence, and that realization settled deeper. With every passing second, because it meant that everything he had relied on might not be enough in moments like this, that there were forces he had never considered, skills he had never needed to develop, and people he had never truly seen. And Naomi was one of those people, someone who had spent her life navigating spaces where she was overlooked, underestimated, or ignored, and in doing so, had learned something far more valuable than control. She had learned awareness, the kind that reads, not just what is said but what is felt, not just what is visible but what is implied, and that awareness was what held the room together now, guiding it away from something irreversible and toward something quieter, something resolved not through dominance, but through understanding. And as the moment continued to unfold under her steady presence, Ethan felt a shift within himself that he could not ignore. The realization that the most important decision in the room was not being made by the person with the most power, but by the person who understood the moment best. And that understanding, quiet and unshaken, was what changed everything. The moment did not resolve with a sudden change. It settled, slowly and deliberately, like a storm that realizes it no longer needs to rage. And Naomi felt that shift before anyone else. The way the tension that once filled every corner of the room now seemed to gather itself, losing its sharp edges, becoming something quieter, something manageable, and she held that moment carefully, knowing that this was the most fragile point, the place where everything could either stabilize or fall apart again. And so she did not rush it. She did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. She allowed it to exist, to stretch just long enough for everyone in the room to feel the difference between what had been and what was now unfolding. And the man in front of her exhaled slowly, almost as if he had been holding his breath without realizing it, his shoulders lowering in a way that no one would have noticed earlier, but now seemed significant, because every small movement carried meaning. Every adjustment reflected a shift in the direction of the moment, and Naomi acknowledged it with nothing more than a slight nod, not as approval, not as victory, but as recognition, the kind that says you are seen, you are understood, and that recognition carried more weight than anything louder ever could, because it allowed him to step back without feeling pushed, to let go without feeling defeated. And that was what changed everything, because people resist when they feel cornered, but they soften when they feel understood, and Naomi had given him that space without ever announcing it. And around them, the room began to breathe again. Chairs adjusted quietly, hands that had been tense relaxed slightly, eyes that had been fixed in uncertainty now moved with cautious awareness, as if everyone was waking up from the same moment at the same time, and Ethan felt it too. The release of pressure he had not fully acknowledged until it was gone, and in its place was something unfamiliar, not relief alone, but reflection, the kind that lingers longer than the moment itself, because what he had just witnessed did not fit into any strategy he had ever used. It was not a negotiation, not a transaction, not a display of authority. It was something deeper, something rooted in understanding rather than control, and that realization stayed with him as he watched Naomi take a small step back, not retreating, but returning the space to what it had been before, as if she had never stepped into the center of it at all, her posture the same, her expression unchanged, her presence once again blending into the background of the room that had finally begun to regain its shape. And yet nothing about it was the same, because everyone who had witnessed that moment now carried something different with them, a quiet awareness that power does not always look the way they expect it to, that sometimes it stands in plain sight, unnoticed until the moment demands it. And Ethan's gaze remained on her longer than he intended, not out of curiosity alone, but out of something closer to respect, the kind that forms when understanding replaces assumption. And for the first time that night, he saw her clearly, not as part of the background, not as a role, but as a person who had just changed the direction of an entire room without raising her voice, without demanding attention, without needing anything in return. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it forced him to confront a truth he had avoided for most of his life, that influence is not always tied to position, and control is not always claimed. Sometimes it is simply held by those who understand what others overlook, and as the last traces of tension faded into something distant and quiet, Naomi turned slightly, her attention returning to the small details of the room, adjusting a glass here, straightening a setting there, as if the moment had never belonged to her at all. And that was what stayed with Ethan the most, not what she had done, but how she had done it, without ego, without display, without ever needing to prove anything. Because she already understood something he was only just beginning to learn, that the strongest presence in any room is not the one that demands control, but the one that knows exactly when it is no longer needed. The room did not return to what it had been before, even though everything on the surface suggested it had. The lights still glowed the same warm amber. The glasses still caught reflections. The low hum of voices slowly resumed. But something deeper had shifted, something that could not be reset or ignored, and Ethan felt it more than anyone. Because for the first time in years, he was not the one shaping the narrative of the room. He was responding to it, adjusting to it, trying to understand. Something that had unfolded without his influence, and that unsettled him in a way no business risk ever had. Because risks could be calculated, negotiated, controlled. But this was different. This was human, unpredictable, and grounded in something he had never needed to rely on. And his eyes followed Naomi as she moved again through the space, her steps quiet, her posture unchanged, her presence blending back into the rhythm of service as if the last several minutes had not placed her at the center of everything. And that contrast struck him harder than anything else, because she was not holding on to the moment. She was not claiming it, not even acknowledging it. She simply returned to what she had been doing before, adjusting a napkin, aligning a glass, offering a quiet word to a guest who was still regaining their composure. And in that return was something profound, something that challenged everything Ethan had been taught about power, because power, in his world, was always displayed, always reinforced, always visible. But what he had just witnessed was the opposite, power that did not need recognition, did not need validation, did not need to be seen to exist. And that realization lingered as he stood there, no longer seated, no longer fully part of the environment he had once controlled, but observing it with a new awareness. And around him, the guests began to process what had happened in their own ways. Some spoke in hushed tones, others avoided the subject entirely. A few glanced toward Naomi with curiosity, with quiet respect, with something close to disbelief, because it is not easy to reconcile what you think you understand with what you have just witnessed. And that tension, that internal adjustment, was now part of the room as much as the lingering scent of wine and polished wood. And Ethan took a step forward without fully deciding to. His movement subtle but intentional, guided by something he had not felt in a long time. Not obligation, not strategy, but curiosity, genuine and unfiltered, the kind that does not seek advantage but seeks understanding. And he stopped just a few feet from Naomi as she finished resetting a table, her hands steady, her attention focused, and for a brief moment, she did not look up, not because she was avoiding him, but because she was completing what she had started. And that detail, small as it was, held weight, because it showed that even now, even after everything, she was not shifting her behavior to match his presence. She was continuing on her own terms, grounded in her role but not defined by it. And when she finally did meet his gaze, it was not with hesitation, not with expectation, just with quiet acknowledgement, as if he were any other person in the room. And that simple equality unsettled him, more than any challenge ever could, because it removed the hierarchy he was used to, the invisible structure that placed him above others in every interaction. And in its absence, he found himself unsure of how to proceed, not because he lacked words, but because the words he would normally use no longer felt appropriate, no longer carried the meaning they once did. And so for a moment, he said nothing, standing there in a silence that was no longer tense but reflective. And in that silence, something shifted again, not in the room this time, but within him, a recognition forming slowly, deliberately, that what he had just witnessed was not an isolated moment, not a coincidence, but a reflection of something deeper, something he had overlooked for far too long. And as Naomi held his gaze without pressure, without expectation, simply present. Ethan Caldwell understood that the lesson of that night was not about what had happened, but about what it revealed, that the true measure of a person is not how they control a room when everything is predictable, but how they respond when nothing is. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence something rare settled between them. Not tension, not expectation, but clarity, the kind that does not rush to fill itself with words because it already understands what needs to be known. And Ethan realized that whatever he said next would not be about restoring control or reclaiming authority. It would be about acknowledging something he could no longer ignore. And that realization slowed him down, stripped away the automatic responses he had relied on for years, leaving only what was real, and that was unfamiliar territory for a man who had built his life on precision and certainty. And Naomi waited without waiting, her posture relaxed, her expression steady, not demanding anything from him, not even a response, as if she understood that this moment was not hers to take, but his to arrive at, and that understanding, quiet and patient, gave him the space to finally speak, his voice lower than usual, not because he intended it, but because the moment required it, because anything louder would have felt out of place, out of alignment with what had just unfolded. And even as he spoke, he realized that the words themselves mattered less than the intention behind them, because for the first time, he was not speaking to maintain a position, he was speaking to recognize another person, and that shift, subtle but profound, changed everything about the interaction, and Naomi listened the same way she had guided the entire room, fully present, not interrupting, not reacting prematurely, simply absorbing what was being said. And in that exchange, brief as it was, something deeper formed, not a transaction, not an agreement, but a mutual understanding that did not need to be defined to be real. And around them, the restaurant continued its slow return to normal, but the normal was different now, shaped by what had happened, influenced by what had been revealed. Conversations resumed with a different tone, movements carried a different awareness, and the space itself seemed to hold onto the quiet echo of the moment that had just passed. And Ethan noticed how people looked at Naomi now, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but subtly, with a respect they had not offered before, and that shift, quiet as it was, said more than any words could have, because respect that is earned in a moment like that does not need to be announced. It exists in the way people adjust, in the way they see you differently without ever saying it aloud. And Naomi did not respond to that change. She did not carry it, did not alter her behavior to match it. She continued exactly as she had before, her focus on the details, on the work, on the rhythm of the room, and that consistency was what made the moment even more powerful, because it showed that what she had done was not an exception, not a performance, but a reflection of who she already was. And Ethan understood that now, not fully, not yet, but enough to recognize that the lesson of the night was not something that could be dismissed or forgotten. It would stay with him, shaping the way he saw things, the way he approached situations, the way he understood people. And as he stepped back, allowing the space between them to return, he realized that nothing about his world had physically changed. The deals would still be made, the numbers would still be calculated, the influence would still exist, but something within him had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, a quiet recalibration of what mattered, of what held real weight when everything else fell away. And as Naomi moved past him once more, her presence as steady and unassuming as it had been from the beginning, Ethan Caldwell knew that the most valuable thing he had witnessed that night was not something he could own, negotiate, or control. It was something he had to learn, something he had to earn, the kind of understanding that cannot be bought, only recognized when it stands right in front of you. The night did not end with applause or recognition. It ended the way most important moments do, quietly, almost invisibly, slipping back into the rhythm of ordinary life while leaving something permanent behind. And as the restaurant continued to fill with soft conversation and measured movements, the weight of what had happened lingered beneath the surface, not loud, not disruptive, but present, like a subtle shift in gravity that everyone could feel even if they could not explain it. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, not because he needed to stay, but because leaving too quickly would have felt like ignoring something he was only beginning to understand. And for a man who had spent his entire life moving forward, making decisions without hesitation, this pause was unfamiliar, but necessary, because some lessons are not meant to be rushed, they are meant to settle, to reshape the way you see things from the inside out. And as he finally turned to leave, his steps slower than before, more deliberate, he realized that the room no longer felt like something he owned. It felt like something he had been allowed to witness, something that had unfolded without his direction and yet had changed him in ways he could not measure. And behind him, Naomi continued her work, the same quiet efficiency, the same steady presence, as if the moment that had shifted everything had never belonged to her at all. And that was what stayed with him the most, not the action itself, but the absence of ownership, the way she had stepped into the center of the moment when it mattered and stepped out just as easily when it no longer did, leaving no trace of ego, no demand for acknowledgement, only the result. And that kind of restraint, that kind of clarity, was something Ethan had never been taught, because in his world, success was measured by visibility, by recognition, by the ability to prove that you were the one who made the difference. But tonight had shown him something else entirely, that the most meaningful impact often comes without announcement, without validation, without any need to be seen at all. And as he reached the exit, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass walls, he paused once more, not to look back, but to take in the realization that had been forming quietly since the moment everything had changed. That control is not something you carry into a room. It is something you earn within it, and it does not belong to the person with the most influence, but to the one who understands the moment best. And that understanding, as simple as it sounded, required something he had never fully embraced: humility, the willingness to recognize that power alone is not enough, that influence without awareness is incomplete, and that true strength is not proven in moments of dominance, but revealed in moments of uncertainty. And as he stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze cutting through the warmth of the evening, Ethan Caldwell carried something with him that no deal, no contract, no negotiation had ever given him before: a quiet shift in perspective, a recalibration of what mattered. And back inside, Naomi placed a final glass on a table, her movements as steady as they had been from the beginning, her focus on the present, on the simple act of doing what needed to be done. And in that simplicity was the truth of the entire night, that she had never been trying to control anything, never trying to prove anything. She had simply understood the moment and responded to it with clarity and calm. And that was enough, more than enough, because while he had entered the room with power, she had left it with something far greater, something that could not be bought or commanded, something that only revealed itself when everything else fell away. And as the last traces of the night settled into quiet normalcy, one truth remained, clear and undeniable: that he had money. But that night, she had the kind of power money could never